In the Bible and the Quran, it is the first death and the first murder. Consumed with rage and jealousy, Cain kills his brother Abel and is banished, condemned to wander the earth alone.
The first murder in the Bible is a fratricide, as if to say all murder is the murder of a brother.
The story is full of riddles. God's preference for brother over brother, Cain's violent response, and a mysterious mark that would inspire hatred and bigotry for 2,000 years.
This story is highly significant and relevant today, especially in the post-9/11 world.
Join scholars and archaeologists as they explore an astonishing past and one of the most brutal and most perplexing stories ever told, the dark mystery of Cain and Abel. The Cain and Abel story is one of the most haunting in the Bible. It depicts the first death of a human being and the first murder of one brother killing another. But what makes this story so powerful is that Cain and Abel is a lesson not just for one family, but for all of mankind.
The story becomes an allegory, and because it is so powerful in reflecting us as a human species and all the dilemmas, all the problems, all the passions and the hatreds and emotions, it becomes so relevant to us in the 21st century.
The very short, enigmatic, cryptic tale of Cain and Abel introduces the theme of fraternal rivalry, which then reverberates throughout the entire book of Genesis.
The tale of Cain and Abel is not for the faint of heart. Brutal and bare bones, just 16 verses of Genesis tell the story of this slaying, and there is a riddle entwined in almost every moment of it. It all begins after God expels Adam and Eve from paradise, and they produce two sons. Cain, their firstborn, becomes a farmer. His younger brother Abel becomes a shepherd. Both brothers try to please God by giving him thanks and offering him sacrifices. These are the first ritual sacrifices ever recorded in the Bible, as each brother makes his offering according to his own livelihood. The Bible tells us that Cain reaches out to God by offering him a sacrifice from his crops. And Abel offers God a sacrifice from his herd, his firstborn lamb. God accepts Abel's offering, but he rejects Cain's for no apparent reason. This is the first of the many riddles in the story. Why would God prefer one sacrifice to another? One brother to another? On this matter, Genesis is mute. But the story continues. Cain becomes angry and jealous of his more successful brother and lashes out.
And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him.
Here's another mystery. If no one had been killed before, let alone murdered, how did Cain know how to kill? And did he even understand what he had done?
Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand.
And now the Bible makes it clear how angry God is with Cain for committing such a heinous crime. He banishes him from his home forever and condemns him to wander the earth alone. Cain pleads with God, saying he is afraid he would be killed by any people he might encounter in the wilderness. So God promises to put a mark on him, so that no one who comes upon Cain will harm him. More riddles. If in the beginning there is only Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, who are the people Cain fears in the wilderness? And most puzzling of all, a riddle that would echo through the ages. What is the mark of Cain? Finally, Cain wanders off into the land of Nod, east of Eden, never to return home again. 16 perplexing verses that generate more questions than answers. But one compelling message does come through loud and clear. Yes, indeed, you are your brother's keeper.
The story is extremely significant because it lays down the principles of war and peace, of goodwill and non-violence, and of really two ways of approaching the world.
According to Dr. Ahmed, the pacifism of Jesus, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King can all be traced back to the story of Cain and Abel, with its message about the brotherhood of man and the importance of nonviolence. But at the same time, the mark of Cain has for hundreds of years been used to demonize and destroy people, nations, and races. Where did this puzzling, contradictory, and almost bizarre story come from? From Sunday school sermons to sophisticated theological debate, the great religions of the world have long struggled to penetrate the mysteries of their sacred texts.
The story of Cain and Abel lives more lives than a cat. It gets interpreted many more times than 9 in the subsequent Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions.
Essentially, it's the same story being told and retold and retold. And with each generation, each century, a new generation of scholars is able to write, embellish, expand on the same story.
Each tradition adds intriguing and surprising details to try and reconcile the riddles and contradictions of this extraordinary story. Despite centuries of feuds and wars and bloodshed, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all agree on one thing. They all trace their beliefs in one God and the concept that all of us are the descendants of Adam and Eve to the ancient Hebrew tribes and the prophet Abraham. The central enduring philosophies of a God of love and forgiveness are the fundamental and uniting force behind the great religions of the world. Nevertheless, each religion has to wrestle with the riddles of the story in its own way. The first great puzzle of the ancient text: why is Cain's offering of grain rejected, while Abel's blood sacrifice is accepted? In fact, in some Quranic commentaries, Abel's sacrifice is not just accepted, it is spectacularly received.
God declared his acceptance in a visible manner. By causing fire to descend from heaven and consume it.
Brother Cain would have had a hard time overlooking that fiery sign of approval from God. In the Quran and the Bible, Cain has no idea why God has rejected his offering and accepted Abel's. And this makes him jealous and angry. While scholars agree the Bible provides no reason for God's preference, they believe the answer to this riddle might be contained within a completely different and startling question.
It's hard to know why God favors Abel's sacrifice over Cain's. But the focus of the text is not on why one offering was accepted and the other was rejected. The focus of the text is that the rejection did not have to split apart the family and result in murder.
Many commentators believe the story's lesson is in God's challenge to Cain, to recognize and accept that his brother has insights, gifts, and talents that he doesn't have, and to recognize that instead of being overcome by jealousy, he could benefit from his brother's ability to please God.
In other words, none of us has it all, and therefore we are dependent on the other in order to acquire those sensitivities, those abilities.
Instead, when Abel is rewarded by God, Cain is filled with resentment. Some other Islamic and Hebrew commentators suggest a startling reason why God accepts Abel's offering, but not the offering of Cain.
Abel's heart is righteous because God knows everything. God knows how we think. God knows our hearts. So God is accepting one offering and not happy with Cain's offering.
But what could Cain have done to offend God? Both traditions offer another explanation to answer this unresolved issue in Genesis. According to some Hebrew and Islamic scholars, it's the predictable source of conflict between two men, a woman. Cain covets the woman who is intended for Abel, hence God's anger with the older brother. The commentators suggest that Cain and Abel had a sister. Her name was Awan. Genesis, by the way, has no trouble with brothers and sisters marrying, because there is no other option at this point. Now Cain's resentments seem a little clearer. God has favored Abel in both marriage and sacrifice. God warns Cain that he must turn away from evil thoughts, but he does not. And so Cain asks his brother to go with him into the fields, with violence in mind. Over the centuries, Islamic tradition adds more details to the story, which emphasize the peaceful ways of Abel.
The two of them are arguing, there's an altercation, and Abel, very much non-violent, in the best traditions that will be followed by generations of non-violence, lies down and says, all right, do with me what you will.
But oddly, despite Abel's passive response, Cain can't finish the terrible deed. But is this really so surprising? In this young world, no human being has yet died, and no man has killed another. According to the commentators of the Holy Quran, only one supernatural being can teach a man how to kill his brother. Enter the serpent. For over 2,000 years, the short and enigmatic story of Cain and Abel has challenged readers of the Bible and the Quran with its mysterious poetry and tantalizing riddles. As the story is interpreted by commentators of the Holy Quran, Abel refuses to fight his brother, even as Cain attempts to strangle him to death. When Cain discovers that despite his best efforts, he can't kill him, the devil appears and speaks to Cain and instructs him how to commit the act of murder. The devil tells Cain to hit his brother on the head with a rock. But what does murder mean in this world without death? The Islamic commentaries offer some detail about just how novel and shocking the situation was. One of them describes how the emotions of sorrow and pain are introduced to the world for the first time by the gloating devil. When the devil visits Eve, who does not yet know that her youngest son is dead, he tells her,
Your son, Abel, is not going to come back to you.
What do you mean?
He's dead. He's killed.
What does killed mean? What does death mean?
Remember, this is just the beginning, the start of everything as far as the human species is concerned. And the devil then explains that he shall not speak to you anymore. He shall not return. He shall not eat. He shall not laugh. He shall not breathe. And she begins to weep. She's after all the mother.
According to the Quran commentaries, Eve's tears are the first tears ever shed by a human being. In the Islamic tradition, this is how sadness first becomes part of human experience. In all of the monotheistic traditions, this is the first instance of death, murder, fratricide, and grief. And forever after, sorrows multiply in both the Old and the New Testaments. Tears, rending of clothes, gnashing of teeth, and shedding of blood, all of them mirror this second fall from God's grace, the killing of a brother. And the rest of the Old Testament is brimming with stories that echo the most violent themes of Cain and Abel. Brothers set against each other, by family, by blood, by inheritance, by jealousy. But something profound begins to happen over time. The angry brothers begin to learn forgiveness. In the 25th chapter in the book of Genesis, the redemption begins with the story of the twin brothers Jacob and Esau, who quarrel over the inheritance of their father Isaac. Jacob and Esau start to fight when they are still in their mother's womb.
Their mother, Rebecca, finds there's a terrible ruckus going on in her womb. She doesn't know what's going on, and she seeks out an oracle from the Lord who says, you've got two nations fighting in your womb. You can imagine what that's like. To have two nations, that's a tough pregnancy when you have two whole nations fighting in the womb.
Esau, who was later associated with Christianity, emerged first and became the eldest and won the inheritance. But Jacob, who symbolized Judaism, never conceded and continued to fight. Jacob finally triumphed over his older brother when he tricked Esau into trading his inheritance for a bowl of lentil soup. Esau is starving at the time, but that buys him no mercy in the story. That Esau would sell his familial rights in exchange for a bowl of soup is sometimes interpreted as a sign of disrespect for his father's traditions. Esau vows to kill Jacob, and Jacob has to flee from Canaan. But after about 20 years, he cannot resist the need to return home. Esau, despite the loss of his birthright, has become powerful and rich and confronts the returning Jacob with an army. But as soon as he sees his brother, he is overcome with joy.
When Esau saw Jacob, he ran to meet him, took him in his arms, threw himself on his neck, and wept as he kissed him.
Here we glimpse a first step toward a gentler meaning of brotherhood than Cain and Abel provide. But the truest reconciliation of the brother against brother theme, first appearing in Cain and Abel, is yet to come.
This sibling rivalry between these brothers ricochets or reverberates throughout the book of Genesis. It comes to its crescendo in its most elaborate form at the very end of Genesis in the story of Joseph.
And it all begins with the famous coat of many colors, a gift from Jacob to his youngest son, Joseph, and a symbol that he will receive his father's inheritance. Joseph's older brothers are filled with jealousy and anger. They steal the multicolored coat, fake his murder, and sell him off to slave traders. Joseph ends up in Egypt, where he is enslaved and thrown into prison. But after 2 years of suffering, Joseph is summoned by the Pharaoh. Pharaoh has learned that this particular slave has a special gift for interpreting dreams. And as Joseph listens to Pharaoh's dream, he realizes it is a divine prophecy. Joseph warns Pharaoh that the waters of the Nile will dry up and a 7-year famine is approaching. And he tells him how to protect the kingdom. The Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph that he appoints him to the highest political office of Egypt. He becomes powerful and wealthy beyond imagining. And finally, his opportunity for vengeance arrives. When he learns that his brothers have come to Egypt to escape the famine, Joseph knows he can destroy them as Cain destroyed Abel. But instead, he welcomes them.
Now don't be grieved nor angry with yourselves that you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life.
Joseph has saved the lives of those who sought to kill him. And so sibling rivalry does not have to mean hatred, violence, triumphalism, or feelings of superiority.
The theme of brotherly betrayal and redemption runs from Cain and Abel through Joseph and his brothers. Another famous betrayal in the Bible occurs, of course, in the story of Jesus. He who preached brotherhood and forgiveness was handed over to the authorities by his disciple and, some might say, spiritual brother, Judas. And he accepted his death with non-violent grace, which, says the Holy Quran, began with Abel. Certainly the cry, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do," could have been a cry for Cain himself, killing without any knowledge of what death or murder really meant. But almost from the inception of institutionalized Christianity, redemption themes in the story of Cain and Abel have been the farthest thing from the minds of some clerics and scholars. Instead, many were obsessed with that great riddle: what was the mark of Cain? The mark that God put upon the first murderer. In Genesis, after Abel dies, there is a truly remarkable exchange between God and Cain. God does not sentence Cain to death for his awful crime, but to banishment, to wander alone in the land of Nod. Still, Cain has the temerity to ask God for help.
Cain said to the Lord, "Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me."
And God agrees to give Cain an unexpected form of protection.
"If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him.
But what is the mark? The story gives no detailed description of it. Some ancient rabbis have said that God made horns grow on Cain's head so he could defend himself. Others believe that Cain was marked with leprosy, a sure guarantee that his enemies would keep their distance. But still others have said that it may have not been a physical mark, that God caused the sun to shine on Cain wherever he went, so all would know that he was under God's protection. And although the mysterious mark is clearly intended to shield Cain from Abel's avengers, it doesn't safeguard his name from hundreds of years of slander and misinterpretation. The Christian father St. Augustine was an early example of a writer who linked Cain and his mark with the forces that crucified Jesus. Around 400 AD, Augustine found himself in the midst of a battle for the survival of the Catholic Church. To defend the Church against its critics, Augustine tried to shift the blame for the evils of the world onto the Jewish people. Augustine believed that the Jews had descended from the murderous Cain, while the non-violent Abel represented Jesus and the Church.
And he sees Abel as representing Jesus, and just as Cain killed Abel, so the Jews killed Jesus. And just as Cain was forced to be a wanderer, rootless, unable to establish himself. That is to be the destiny of the Jewish people.
Augustine wrote in his famous work, The City of God,
"He was a type of the Jews that killed Christ, prefigured in the shepherd Abel."
The writings of Augustine did nothing to slow the growth of an anti-Semitic movement that eventually spread across the world. In the 13th century, Pope Innocent III echoed Augustine's view of Cain and Abel and issued a papal order for all Jews to distinguish themselves by their clothing. A century later, in Spain, Alfonso X issued a similar law.
Any Jew who does not bear such identifying mark shall pay for each time he is found without it 10 maravedis of gold. And if he has not the means to do this, he shall receive 10 lashes for his offense.
But the Christians were not alone in the use of the mark of Cain to justify crimes against humanity. In the 17th century, slavery was justified by many church-going Englishmen who believed Africans were the bearers of the mark of Cain. 100 years later, in 1852, Brigham Young, president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, said this:
"I tell you, this people that are commonly called Negroes are the children of old Cain."
In the 20th century, this twisting of Genesis took another ominous turn. In 1941, when the Nazis ordered all German Jews to identify themselves in public with a yellow star, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wrote a newspaper editorial in which he compared the yellow star to the mark of Cain and mocked the Berlin Jews for attempting to cover it up.
Each Jew on the street bought a newspaper to conceal his mark of Cain.
And after, the anti-Semitic and racist interpretation of Cain and Abel lived on in the violent rhetoric of one hate group after another. In support of their views, they frequently repeated the claim that Cain's mark is actually black skin, that Cain's descendants are black, and that Africans and Jews have both been cursed by God for the murder of Jesus. But today, most Christian and Jewish scholars agree that the spiritual concepts behind the story of Cain and Abel have been hijacked and completely miss the deeper point.
The mark of Cain is sometimes understood as the sign of a curse, the sign of punishment. But it's also seen and read and interpreted as a sign of God's mercy. It provides protection.
But why would God protect Cain, a cold-blooded murderer? This has been one of the most enduring mysteries of this perplexing story. One answer comes from the ancient rabbis who commented extensively on Genesis, and their answer is one that might be recognizable in a court of law today. They made the observation that before Cain killed Abel, no one had ever died before. And if Cain had no idea what would happen when he struck his brother with the rock, the crime was not murder in the first degree. It was an accident. And in ancient Hebrew courts, accidental killing was not punishable by death. Today, some modern Jewish scholars suggest another possibility, one that challenges the long-held Christian perception of the Old Testament God as an angry, vengeful God.
One of the answers that you find, oddly enough, is that he actually repented.
When Cain begs God for mercy, the ancient Hebrew is often translated as, "My punishment is too great to bear." But another translation of Cain's plea to God creates a very different impression.
The word for punishment, the Hebrew word avon, can also be translated as iniquity. So sometimes it's translated as the iniquity of what I've done. The enormity, the magnitude of the sin that I have performed is greater than I can't tolerate this.
And according to rabbinic theology, there is no one who is so lost in sin that he can't be forgiven.
So here you've got the original fratricide, the murderer of his brother, for what seems to be no good reason at all. And yet he is forgiven and protected because of his repentance.
There are other signs of God's forgiveness toward Cain. After wandering in the wilderness, Cain has a son, Enoch, and he builds a city in Enoch's honor. It is the first city and the founding of civilization. For archaeologists and historians, there are kernels of truth in the story of Cain and Abel, kernels to be found hidden in the shadows of the Egyptian pyramids. Others think the story goes much further back, to the dawn of civilization and the site of the original Eden. This is Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, of course, but also the land where the Israelites lived for generations. That other spiritual descendant of Cain, Joseph, made a home here for his once treacherous brothers and all of his people. Nearly 400 years later, however, Pharaoh grew afraid of the Israelites' prosperity and enslaved them. Then a Pharaoh's daughter found a baby in a river and raised him in the royal household. Thus begins the story of Moses, savior of the Jewish people, leader of the great Exodus. According to Scripture, God dictated the 5 books of the Hebrew Bible to Moses on Mount Sinai. But there are scholars who think Moses may have taken more out of Egypt than his people. He may have taken bits of Egyptian religion as well, bits that seem to resonate in amazing ways with the story of Cain and Abel. The Egyptians immortalized the stories of their religion on the walls of their own tombs deep inside the pyramids. And it is here where we find tantalizing parallels with the conflict between those first brothers of the Old Testament and that first murder.
And if you go into the tombs, you can see these writings right on the wall. Stories about creation, references to the first city. Many of the elements you find in the biblical Genesis stories, you find in these ancient writings.
The Pyramid of Unas is over 4,000 years old. Hundreds of magical spells are inscribed on the walls of this sanctuary. Among the spells and incantations is a powerful story of jealousy and fratricide, strikingly similar to Cain and Abel. The Egyptian hieroglyphics tell the story of 2 brothers, the gods Osiris and Seth. Osiris was the god of agriculture and the ruler of the world, and Seth was the god of war and conflict. One day, Seth became jealous and murdered Osiris, chopped him up into 42 pieces, and scattered him all over the world. Fratricide is not the only echo of the story of Cain and Abel. We also find a detail that parallels the later commentaries on Genesis. The 2 Egyptian gods fought to the death because they were both in love with the same woman, their sister. Just as the Hebrew and Muslim commentators say that Cain killed Abel over the love of their sister. Today, scholars and archaeologists see other similarities. A story that resonates with the fall of man, the expulsion from Eden, and of Cain's role in a totally new way for mankind to live.
Almost all religions have some sort of moment of creation, and in ancient Egypt, like in Genesis, you have this sort of perfect, idyllic, very pastoral kind of place where you have animals and things, people, everyone's living together in a harmonious way, which of course has to be shattered before you can go on for civilization to be created.
In the Egyptian religion, Osiris is resurrected, and he builds the first city of Egypt, Heliopolis, which is now in ruins on the outskirts of Cairo.
In Genesis, Genesis, Cain goes out and builds the first city. So we see a large number of parallels between the Egyptian story and the biblical story.
And it's interesting because in the Torah, everything that Osiris does actually is given over to some extent to Cain, going over and founding cities, having agriculture, passing out ideas to people to sort of be good, settled, non-nomadic people.
But for many scientists and scholars, whatever Egyptian elements may have influenced the Old Testament story of Cain and Abel, they are rooted even deeper in human prehistory. They hearken back to a violent and astounding event. Some say perhaps the most important revolution in the history of man: agriculture. The vital clues lie in those first sacrifices in the Old Testament. Cain, the farmer, offering up grain and fruit. Abel, the herder, offering his firstborn lamb.
Now, this is the sort of story that you can compare to what happened around 7000 BC, what we call the Neolithic Revolution, when these two groups of people, the farmers and the shepherds, started to get into conflict with each other.
It all began in the cradle of civilization in what is now Iraq. People had begun to move away from Stone Age hunter-gatherer ways and had started controlling their environments. They no longer gathered food, they produced it. There were those who domesticated animals, the herders, and those who domesticated plants, the farmers. Experts think violence erupted when bands of herders moved through the countryside and allowed their herds of animals to feed on and trample the farmers' fields and crops. The ensuing battles left many dead and became the stuff of legend. But eventually, the nomadic groups began to settle down and adopt the more sophisticated ways of the farmers. As villages became small cities and the populations grew, a new culture of early civilization began to emerge. The stories of the clashes between herders and farmers were eventually written down on clay tablets by the people who invented writing, the Sumerians. The Sumerians lived in Mesopotamia, part of which is now known as Iraq, over 6,000 years ago.
They're the people that I consider to be one of the most gifted people on the whole face of the earth, because they invented writing, they invented laws, they invented all sorts of moral reasoning, proverbs, they invented religious belief systems to explain why there's good and why there's evil.
Carved in stone tablets, Sumerian accounts of the battles between the shepherds and farmers took the shape of a myth, strikingly similar to the story of Cain and Abel. In the Sumerian tale, the shepherd god Dumuzi battles with his brother, the farmer god Enkidu, for the favors of their sister, the goddess Inanna. But how would such a tale have survived for thousands of years to become part of a monotheistic tradition?
I think we have to realize that the stories in Genesis are oral traditions originally. They are stories told by the elders of tribes to the rest of the tribe. And of course they're going to get changed and distorted slightly over time. But essentially, until they're written down for the first time, these are oral traditions, and that's what Genesis is.
The biblical record shows another remarkable parallel with this oral history of the agricultural revolution. It seems that after all of those thousands of years of tales told around campfires, the location of where it all began may have been preserved, the place called Eden.
You've got to look at the geography, the landscape of the story. That really is where you find the Cain and Abel story, in the landscape.
The Garden of Eden, says the Bible, is located at the headwaters of 4 rivers, including the Tigris and Euphrates, which are still known today by their biblical names.
Those 2 rivers we knew about from the start, so those weren't difficult. The real problem was, where were the other 2 rivers?
The other 2 biblical rivers, the Gihon and Pishon, do not appear on any modern map. Roll believes the modern-day Araxes River, which flows from the north of Lake Urmia to the Caspian Sea to the east, is the biblical Gihon River. And the Uzun, which rises near Mount Sahand, was once called the Pishon. A study of the ancient languages shows that over time, the letter P was often substituted for the letter U, making it quite possible that the biblical river Pishon became known as the river Ushan. Having identified all 4 biblical rivers, Roll believes he has found the lost Garden of Eden.
So let's bring up our 4 quadrants, the 4 quarters of Eden, if you like, and at the center, at the heart, is the land of Eden itself. And that is where the Garden of Eden is located.
According to Dr. Roll, the Garden of Eden is located in what is now known as Western Iran. This is the place, Roll believes, where the story of Cain and Abel has its origins. But not all scholars agree. Dr. Uris Zarins puts the Garden of Eden further south, where the Euphrates and Tigris rivers meet the Persian Gulf. According to Zarins, satellite images of the Middle East reveal the traces of an ancient fossil river that once flowed through northern Arabia and through the now dry valleys. This river, he claims, is the lost biblical river Pishon. The 4th river, the Gihon, is the present-day Karun flowing into the Persian Gulf, where Zarins concludes the Garden of Eden is submerged beneath the water. 7,000 years ago, according to geologic surveys, the Persian Gulf was not the huge body of water it is today, but a lush green valley filled with rivers and freshwater springs.
I would say the first people who were living there would be people who were hunters and gatherers, looking at a large oasis. There would be a huge number of river systems coming in from the north, and they would be exploiting resources in that area, and along the rivers, along marshes, along banks, maybe a cut bank of some kind, maybe even a little lake in the area. And they would have a tremendous amount of resources in the area at about, 7,000 years ago, 5,000 BC.
Precise geography aside, both scholars agree that the story of Cain and Abel originated in ancient Mesopotamia some 7,000 years ago. Cain's way of settled farming triumphed over the less productive nomadic traditions of shepherds and their herds of animals. And once man learned to control nature and grow his crops according to his needs, he was able to stop wandering across the lands in search of food, to put down roots, build villages and cities, and develop more and more advanced technologies that ultimately led to a sophisticated culture of art, music, and the written word that would endure for all time. There is a heart-rending coda to the story of Cain and Abel that is not in Genesis, but is a vital part of the Islamic tradition. Cain, realizing the depths of his sin for the first time, tries to hide it from the eyes of man and God.
When Cain actually kills Abel, he doesn't know what to do with the body. The body is lying on stony ground. He doesn't know what to do with the body itself until he sees a raven or a crow killing another raven, and then with his beak making a little hole and then burying that raven and putting some sand on it. So that gives Cain the idea of how to bury a human body, and that's what he does.
And this, the commentaries say, is how the concept of human burial originated. For many scholars, Cain's crime resonates with sins found throughout the Old Testament, and the belief that it's not just the sinful act, but the attempt to hide it from the eyes of God that incurs his wrath, which is precisely what happened to Cain's parents. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve disobey God and eat from the tree of knowledge. And when he asks them why they have disobeyed him, Instead of accepting responsibility for their own actions, they blame the serpent for tempting them. Just as Cain refuses to accept responsibility for killing his brother.
I'm not sure God is opposed to the claiming of knowledge that is inherent in taking the forbidden fruit. But what God finds dreadfully reprehensible is the fact that they will not own up to what they've done. And that failure to be responsible gets replayed by Cain.
And Cain's sin goes even deeper than murder and denial, as one interpretation of the text suggests.
And the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground."
The Hebrew word for blood is damim, and a more accurate translation of the phrase would be in the plural. Your brother's bloods are crying out to me from the ground.
What do you mean bloods? He just killed one person. And the answer is, it's the blood of Abel himself and of all his descendants, ad sof ha'olam, until the world comes to an end. All the descendants that would have come out of Abel will not be able to come out of him now that he was killed. So the person who kills someone really kills more than just that one person.
When Cain killed his brother, he didn't just kill one man. He destroyed a whole world.
We are infinitely precious. That's an affirmation that seems to me built into the heart of the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions.
But this story also asks one of the most profound and audacious questions of the Bible. Am I my brother's keeper? Clearly, the text is telling us that we are all indeed caretakers of each other. But what of God's responsibility? Why is he not the keeper of his children? Why does he let bad things happen to good people?
And we can all ask the question, why doesn't God prevent murders? Why didn't God prevent the Holocaust? Why didn't God prevent 9/11? The biblical teaching would be that people have obligations to prevent those things. They cannot rely on the miracle of God's intervention.
And so we come to the end of the remarkable tale of Cain and Abel. According to ancient Hebrew texts, Cain settled down and married his sister, had a son, built a city, and lit the candle of civilization. The mark upon him, whatever form it may have taken, sent him down a path that would enlighten humankind forever. But too often the lessons Cain learned have been forgotten or turned into terrible rationales for retribution along the way. Perhaps the deepest irony is this: all of the monotheistic religions are literal and spiritual brothers. In their holiest writings, all claim descent from Adam and Eve. All recognize the lessons of Cain and Abel. But their descendants have spent centuries trying to conquer, even exterminate each other. And the true message of the first fratricide seems lost. Millennia of murderous anti-Semitism. The Crusades bent on ending the golden age of Islam. And now, terrible religious conflict in the Middle East. Today, more than ever, the message of the first death, the first murder, the first sorrow, and the first forgiveness beg our attention.
For me, the story of Cain and Abel is highly significant and relevant today, especially in the post-9/11 world. The two great ideas in play after 9/11 are the ideas of the clash of civilizations or the idea of the dialogue of civilizations.
The Bible ultimately recognizes that we are all bound one to another and therefore our obligations and our duties extend ultimately to the ends of the earth.
For God's sake, for our own future, for our children's sakes, let's pull back. Let us take the example of Abel. Let's bring him to the forefront of our discussion. So when I have a conversation or a dialogue with my enemy, with the person I don't like, I will still be tolerant. I will still be accommodating. He may hit me on one cheek, I'll turn the other cheek, because ultimately, that is the moral authority that God required of me.